The city outside my office window looked like it had been carved from ice. Chicago in December was always like that, cold and sharp enough to make the glass feel alive under your hand. The late afternoon sun hit the high-rises across the river, turning everything into gold for a few minutes before it all went gray again. I was signing the last page of a contract for the new expansion of my company, North Shore Retreats, when my phone buzzed beside the pen. Mom! Her name lit up on the screen. It had been weeks since I heard from her. Every call came with the same careful tone, polite enough to hurt. I hesitated, let it ring twice before I picked up. Her voice was soft, too soft, Emily, sweetheart. Your brother's wedding is next month. I froze halfway through setting the pen down. That's great, Mom. Where's it going to be? She hesitated. Just a small thing, really. Family only. You understand. The words fell into the room like a thin layer of frost. Family only. I tried to sound casual. Sure, I understand. Who's handling the arrangements? A pause, then her breath caught. They found a beautiful venue outside Denver. Ethan and Lily wanted something simple, elegant. You'd love it, I think. My throat felt tight. Denver. My company's flagship property was there. The same retreat I'd built from nothing, the one people used to laugh at when it was just an empty piece of land covered in snow. Mom kept talking, filling the silence the way she always did when she was uncomfortable. It'll just be perfect, dear. I know you've been busy with your work anyway. You wouldn't enjoy the crowd. The words blurred together until I couldn't tell if she was excusing herself or erasing me again. I waited until she stopped. Well, send me pictures, I said. Of course she breathed out, sounding relieved, like we'd avoided something messy. I knew you'd understand. When the line clicked and went dead, the quiet in the room thickened. I stared at my reflection in the glass, the skyline of Chicago layered behind my face. For a moment, I just sat there listening to the hum of the heating system and the faint whistle of wind against the windows. Then I turned back to my laptop. A new email blinked on the corner of the screen, an automated update from our corporate system. Reservation confirmed, Ethan and Lily Miller wedding. North Shore Retreat, Denver. I leaned closer, reading it twice. The header carried the corporate watermark, the one only an authorized executive could use. There was a line at the bottom marked, Approved by E. Carter. My name, my signature. A quiet laugh slipped out, the kind that has no humor in it. I picked up the phone and called Harper, my operations manager. Hey Harper, can you check something for me? Look up the Denver property, the new booking for next month. A pause, then the sound of typing. Yeah, I see it. Private event. Miller wedding. VIP. Who authorized it? She hesitated. Emily Carter. That's impossible. I didn't sign anything this week. Check the payment source. More typing. It's listed under a corporate account. Same one we use for development expenses. My fingers tapped the edge of the desk. Who requested it? Linda Miller. She's marked as family of ownership. I closed my eyes, feeling the cold crawl down my back. Harper's voice softened. Do you want me to cancel it? No. Keep it as is. Make sure everything looks perfect. Are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. When the call ended, I sat still for a long moment. The sun had already disappeared, leaving the room in that pale blue shadow that comes right before dark. I could see my breath faintly against the glass. The city lights were flickering on street by street, so this was how it was going to be. My mother, my brother, his bride. A wedding planned under my company's roof on property I bought, paid for, and built. And I wasn't even invited. I reached for the folder on the corner of my desk, the one with the original purchase agreement for the Denver retreat. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges from years of being moved and handled. I ran a hand over the signature line where my name was written in neat black ink. For a moment, memories slipped through my mother standing in the kitchen when I told her about buying that first piece of land, the dismissive shake of her head. You should be more realistic, Emily. Dreams don't pay the bills. Maybe not, I thought now, but they build something real. I stood and crossed the room, the heels of my shoes clicking against the marble floor. The office felt too large, too quiet. Outside, the Chicago River glimmered in the last traces of daylight. My reflection in the window was calm, steady, the way people said I always looked when I was angry. I pressed my hand lightly against the glass. If they wanted to hold their perfect wedding under my roof, let them. Let them walk through every hallway toast in every room. They'd already written me out of the family. Now they were stepping into the world I'd made without even realizing who owned the ground beneath their feet. I let out a long breath, slow and even. My pulse steadied. The anger wasn't hot anymore. It was something colder, more controlled. Across the city, the first snowflakes began to fall, swirling under the streetlights. I turned away from the window, picked up my coat, and switched off the lights. The glass went black, my reflection disappearing with the skyline. By the time I reached the elevator, I'd already decided. No confrontation, no shouting, just patience. They would arrive at the Denver property believing they owned the moment. But I owned everything else. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing the quiet behind me. The next morning, the air in my apartment felt heavier than usual, the kind of stillness that waits before a storm. I poured myself coffee and stared at the skyline, the edges of the buildings glowing pale in the early winter light. The night before had been too long, my mind replaying my mother's voice, the sound of her certainty when she said family only. By 9, I was back in the office. Harper was already there, standing by my desk, holding a folder pressed against her chest. She didn't look at me right away. "There's something you should see," she said finally. I took the folder from her and flipped it open. The first page carried a copy of an electronic document, my company's official letterhead, the digital signature line stamped with my name. Underneath it, a transfer confirmation. 30% of North Shore Retreats equity reassigned to Ethan Miller, authorized by Linda Miller. My pulse didn't move. For a second, it was like watching a film of someone else's life. Harper started talking quietly. "It looks like she used one of your old digital credentials from before we upgraded security. I don't even know how she found access." I closed the folder. "It's not about how, Harper. It's about why." She hesitated, waiting for me to explode. I didn't. The anger had settled somewhere deeper, colder. I went to the window. The Chicago River shimmered under a strip of light. It was a view I'd always loved, the water cutting through the city like a quiet pulse. "You remember that clause we added 2 years ago," I said. "The ethics one for misuse of assets." "Of course. Activate it. File an internal notice. Don't confront anyone yet." She blinked. "You're not going to call them?" I turned back to her. "What would I say, Harper?" "That they've outdone themselves this time." "No. Let's do it the right way." She nodded slowly and left to make the call to legal. When the door closed, I sank into the chair and opened my laptop. I found the original incorporation documents, the same ones I'd signed a decade ago, in a borrowed conference room when the company was just an idea on paper. The screen glowed against my face. My name was everywhere, clean, confident. The same name they were now using to steal from me. A part of me wanted to laugh. The same people who told me I wasn't built for business were now forging my signature to take it from me. The phone rang again. It was our counsel in Denver, David. His voice carried the careful tone of someone walking across thin ice. "Emily, I received an alert from your operations manager. You want me to initiate a verification process on the equity transfer?" "Yes. Keep it quiet for now. I want documentation, not drama." "Understood. I'll start a report with the Colorado Business Bureau. You'll need to provide a personal affidavit. Send it over." When I hung up, the room felt too quiet again. I leaned back and let my eyes close for a moment. 10 years ago, I was 28 and working the night shift at a hotel in Seattle, wearing a uniform that never fit quite right. My father had come by once after dinner with clients still in his suit, smelling of cologne and disappointment. He looked around the lobby like it embarrassed him. "You need to be more practical," he said. "You can't build a life out of ideas and ambition." Maybe he was right back then. I had nothing but a degree. I didn't use a laptop that overheated, and a stack of notes on a concept for destination retreats that combined work and wellness. But a year later, I sold my first project to a small investor in Denver. It wasn't luck. It was the only thing I'd ever built with both hands shaking and still refused to drop. Now here I was a decade later, watching my parents and brother strip pieces off what I created like they had the right to. The door opened again. Harper stepped in quietly. Legal's on it. They'll freeze any ownership changes until the review's complete. Do you want to inform the board? Not yet. Let them sleep. She hesitated. Emily, can I ask something? Go ahead. Why aren't you angry? I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Anger's a waste of energy. I learned that from them. She studied me for a second, then left me alone again. I stared at the folder still lying open on the desk. My name copied and pasted like it meant nothing. I thought about the family group texts that had gone silent years ago. The birthdays missed the polite emails exchanged around holidays. It had always been distance disguised as civility. My phone buzzed again. A new message from an unknown number. Thanks for approving the transfer, it read. Mom said you'd come around eventually. The number ended in Ethan's area code. I didn't reply. I just sat there letting the words sink in until they lost their meaning. By late afternoon, the snow started again. It fell thick and slow against the glass covering the river until the whole city looked washed out. I shut the folder and placed it inside the safe under my desk. Before leaving, I typed an email to Harper. Subject: internal compliance. Make sure all property contracts, including Denver, are under corporate protection. Activate clause review. Do not disclose to family contacts. When I hit send, the screen dimmed. My reflection stared back at me, tired but steady. They had taken my name off the wedding invitation. But my name was still on every document that mattered. And now those documents would be the ones to speak for me. I turned off the lights and stepped into the hallway. The office was empty, the sound of the snow pressing against the windows like a whisper. Tomorrow the papers would start moving. Quietly, legally, precisely. And when they finally realized what they'd done, it wouldn't be a fight. It would be a reckoning. 2 days later, the snow had stopped, leaving Chicago wrapped in a hard, bright silence. I was back in my office before sunrise, the kind of morning that felt too calm for what I knew was coming. The paperwork had been filed. Legal confirmations were already moving through Denver. All that was left was to wait. By noon, Harper walked in holding her tablet, her expression unreadable. "They've arrived," she said. I looked up. "Denver." She nodded. "The Miller family checked into the resort an hour ago. Black SUV's private driver the whole show." I leaned back in my chair. "How do they look?" "Like people who think they own the place." I gestured for her to connect the security feed. The main lobby of the Denver property filled the screen, the familiar stone fireplace burning behind the front desk. My mother stood in the center, wearing a white coat, her hair perfectly set. She smiled at the staff, waving like she was greeting loyal subjects. Beside her, Ethan and Lily posed for a phone camera. Lily was live streaming, narrating every corner as if it were her personal fairy tale. "Look at this," she was saying, her voice carrying over the feed. "This is our family's resort. Isn't it beautiful?" My jaw tightened. Family's resort. Harper watched the monitor and exhaled softly. "Do you want me to correct them?" "No. Let them talk." We both turned as the camera followed my mother. She was gesturing toward the concierge, her manicured hands sweeping the air. "Make sure to use white orchids in the lobby arrangements," she was saying, "and I'd like to replace the champagne on the guest tables. Something French, not domestic." The concierge nodded nervously, typing into the system. Harper glanced at me. "That's another 20 grand at least." "Record everything under internal review," I said. "Keep copies of all receipts. No response to ownership claims." "Got it." I muted the audio and sat back watching them move through the lobby like they were walking through a stage set. My father trailed behind, phone in hand, pretending to check messages, but really just avoiding the camera. A memory surfaced uninvited. I was 16, standing beside him at a family dinner, listening to him tell a colleague how proud he was of Ethan getting into business school. He never mentioned me. When I excused myself to clear the table, my mother smiled at the guest and said, "Emily likes to keep busy." Harper's voice pulled me back. "They just requested access to the executive suite for pre-wedding prep." I turned to her. "That's restricted." "I know, but they said Mrs. Miller authorized it." "Of course she did. Approve the access," I said. "Let them in." She hesitated. "Emily?" It's fine. When Harper left, I stayed with the screen. The feed shifted between angles: the hallway, the ballroom, the terrace overlooking the mountains. Every corner of that place held something I'd chosen, from the wood finish to the lighting temperature. I remembered the nights I spent there during construction, sleeping on a cot, checking blueprints by flashlight. My parents never came once. Now they were calling it theirs. Hours passed. Harper came back later in the afternoon looking uneasy. They're running up expenses like it's monopoly money. New floral designer imported linens, upgraded bar package. All charged to the corporate account. Keep letting them, I said. You sure about that? Absolutely. Every transaction is another signature. She studied me. You're playing a long game. I looked at the screen again, where my mother was inspecting table settings. She had that smile she used when she thought the world belonged to her. It's not a game, Harper. It's documentation. That evening I flew out to Denver. I didn't tell anyone. The air was colder there, thinner, the mountains standing like quiet witnesses beyond the glass of the terminal. By the time I reached the resort, the sun had set and the building glowed warm against the snow. Inside, the lobby was buzzing. Guests in formal wear drifted through, staff carrying trays of champagne. I stayed by the far column, half hidden, watching. Lily was posing by the fireplace, her phone balanced on a tripod, recording everything for her followers. Ethan hovered close, adjusting his cufflinks, smiling the way he did when he wanted attention. My mother stood near the check-in desk, laughing with the event manager. She touched the marble counter and said something that made the woman laugh nervously. Through the murmur, I caught her voice. My family built this place. My daughter helped, I suppose, but she's more comfortable behind a desk. The words hit harder than I expected. I took a slow breath and kept still. Harper spotted me from across the room and walked over. You really came. I had to see it myself. She lowered her voice. Want me to say something? No. Let them have their illusion. From where we stood, the chandelier lights shimmered across the marble floor, casting reflections like tiny suns. My mother looked radiant in her silver dress, laughing with a glass of champagne in her hand. May I? Harper asked softly, handing me an earpiece linked to the security team. I slipped it on. The feed buzzed faintly, catching snippets of conversation from staff. Everything's fine downstairs. Mrs. Miller wants to change the flower arrangement again. Of course she does, I murmured. Harper followed my gaze. Does it hurt? I turned to her. What do you think? She didn't answer. An hour later, the crowd thinned. I walked toward the hallway leading to the conference room that overlooked the ballroom. The glass there was tinted from the outside. They couldn't see me. I stood behind it, looking down at them, the laughter, the flash of cameras. My mother leaned close to a guest, smiling wide. I heard her say, "Thank God Emily isn't here. She always brings the mood down." I felt the words settle inside me, not sharp, just heavy. Then I smiled. Not the kind people wear for pictures, but the one that comes when something inside finally clicks into place. Harper's voice came through the earpiece. You okay? Perfectly fine. I turned away from the glass and started walking. The echo of my heels against the floor was the only sound. The night outside was cold and endless, the kind that made your breath look like smoke. They thought they were untouchable, that this was their moment. But the truth was already waiting in the paperwork, sealed and legal, patient as the snow outside. And soon they'd start to feel it closing in. The morning light cut through the Denver skyline like a blade, sharp and cold. I barely slept, the edges of my thoughts still heavy from what I'd seen the night before. By the time Harper knocked on my suite door, I was already dressed, coffee untouched, beside a stack of reports. They did it again, she said as soon as she walked in. Her voice carried that controlled panic I knew too well. They authorized a new liquor shipment. $30,000. Signature says Emily Carter. I looked up. The air between us stilled. Send me the invoice, I said. She handed me her tablet. The digital contract blinked, the signature identical to mine, copied clean. There was no anger left, just a quiet decision forming in the space behind my ribs. Cancel the bridal suite, I said. Harper blinked. What? Cancel it. Effective immediately. Log the reason as violation of corporate finance policy. You're serious? Completely. She hesitated for a moment before typing the command. Once she hit send, she exhaled slowly like someone lighting a fuse. Downstairs, the resort hummed with activity. Staff wheeled carts of champagne florists arranged white orchids. Photographers tested lighting near the window arches. From the control office, I watched the live feed as the concierge received the cancellation notice on his screen. His eyes widened. Within minutes, the comm cracked. The camera caught Lily at the front desk, still in her robe, hair half done, gesturing in disbelief. Ethan stood beside her, his phone in one hand, his voice rising. Harper stood beside me, watching the scene unfold like a storm she couldn't stop. The concierge spoke gently, but his words were clear. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but your suite has been deactivated. It's flagged as unauthorized under company policy." Lily frowned. "What does that even mean?" "This is our wedding." Ethan leaned forward. "My mother handled everything. There must be a mistake." "Yes, sir," the concierge said carefully. "That's part of the issue." Then my mother appeared in the frame, wrapped in a tailored coat, the picture of authority. She pushed between them, her voice sharp. "Excuse me, I'm Linda Miller, and this is my property. You will fix this immediately." The concierge straightened, clearly torn between politeness and protocol. "Of course, Mrs. Miller. But according to our system, ownership is listed differently." "Differently," she snapped. "What is that supposed to mean?" Harper glanced at me, whispering. "Do we step in?" "Not yet," I said. The manager on duty approached, then a calm man in a dark vest, his face composed. He glanced once at the screen on his tablet before looking up at her. "I'm afraid the decision came from the company's headquarters, Mrs. Miller. From the owner herself." "And who might that be?" she demanded. He didn't flinch. "Ms. Emily Carter." The moment hung suspended, soundless. Then, like glass cracking, everything broke. My mother's face froze. Ethan's mouth opened, no words coming. Lily looked between them, her mascara smudged. Guests nearby had started to notice. A travel journalist, camera already in hand, turned instinctively toward the noise. Harper whispered beside me, "Oh my God, they're recording." I said nothing. On the feed, my mother tried to recover her tone, changing desperate. "That's impossible. She doesn't own this. We own this." The manager's reply was simple, practiced. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but corporate records show otherwise. The owner has canceled the suite." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room like smoke. Ethan slammed his hand on the counter. "This is insane." Lily's voice cracked. "My followers are expecting the reveal. You're ruining everything." The journalist's camera light blinked red, catching every second. From where I stood on the top floor watching through the glass wall of my office, the entire scene looked small, almost staged. The same people who had erased me from their lives were now standing in the center of my creation, begging for control they never had. Harper's voice came through the intercom. "They want to speak to the owner." I turned slightly, eyes still on the screen. "Tell them they already did." Downstairs, I could see the moment the message reached the manager. He nodded once, repeating my words exactly. "I've been informed that you're already speaking with her." My mother's lips parted, confusion flickering into realization. Then the color drained from her face. Harper whispered, "That was it. No, that was the beginning." Through the camera feed, I watched the reporter lower her lens, checking playback, a small smile curling at the corner of her mouth. She knew she'd just captured something rare. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft against the wide windows. I turned from the screen, walked to the edge of the glass wall that overlooked the lobby below. From here, I could see the chandelier glittering above them, the same one I'd chosen 5 years ago. My reflection ghosted against the window, calm, untouchable. Harper stood behind me. "What now?" "Now we let the system do what it was designed to do." "Meaning, accountability," I said. She exhaled a small sound of disbelief. "They're going to lose it. I know." Down below, security staff moved discreetly, keeping the crowd from forming too closely. The music that had been playing in the background died out, replaced by the sound of voices, angry, confused, embarrassed. For a brief moment, my mother looked up toward the mezzanine, eyes scanning the glass, as if she could sense me there. She couldn't see me, but I saw her clearly. The way her shoulders squared, the tremor in her hand as she tried to regain composure. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was the calm that follows when a truth finally lands where it belongs. Harper's phone buzzed. She read the screen, then looked at me. Local press already picked up the clip. It's spreading fast. I nodded once. Keep the staff professional. No comments, no names. She turned to leave, then paused. You're not going down there, no. I've already said everything I needed to. When she was gone, I stayed by the window, the snow thickening outside. The guests began to drift away, whispering, the lights reflecting off the marble floors. My mother stood perfectly still in the center of it all, Ethan pacing beside her, Lily crying quietly into her phone. Some truths didn't need to be shouted. They just needed to be seen. And now everyone had seen them. By the next morning, the story had escaped the walls of the resort. It moved the way fire moved, fast, unpredictable, and hungry. My phone started vibrating before dawn, a steady pulse that wouldn't stop. By the time I sat down at my desk in the Denver office, every major outlet had picked it up. On the screen in front of me, a headline glowed in bold: family claims ownership gets denied by real CEO. Below it, a frozen image from the lobby footage. My mother's shocked face mid-sentence, Ethan behind her, his mouth open as if words had failed him. Someone had added a caption, "Karma checks in at the front desk." Harper stood by the door, scrolling through her phone, eyes wide. It's everywhere, she said quietly. Twitter, TikTok, even the business networks. Hashtag Miller wedding disaster hit number 3 overnight. I didn't look up from the screen. How bad is it? Depends on what side you're on, she said. Most people are cheering for you. Of course they were. Americans love poetic justice, especially when it comes wrapped in luxury and family drama. The office phone rang again. Harper reached for it. She listened, then mouthed, "Abigail Green." I nodded and took the call. Abigail's voice was clipped, polished, the sound of someone used to controlling a room. "Emily, I need to know what's happening. Is this true? Are these people actually related to you?" "They were," I said. I leaned back. "For the record, Abigail, nothing illegal occurred on our end. The resort followed internal compliance." She paused. "You realize investors don't like noise. I need to ensure this doesn't become a scandal." "A scandal is when people lie," I said. "I just let the truth walk into the light." There was a long silence. Then she sighed. "Keep it clean, Emily. The market rewards control." "Always has," I said and hung up. Harper watched me for a moment, then shook her head. "That woman terrifies me. She's not terrifying. She's just allergic to mess." Outside the window, snow had started again, the thick kind that made everything look softer than it really was. By afternoon, reporters had gathered near the resort gates. Security footage showed them lining up, microphones in hand, hoping for a statement. None of them would get one. Harper and I had briefed every manager, no comment, no confirmation. Let the footage speak. It did. Clips of my mother yelling at the concierge replayed on national news by evening. One commentator on a business show laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes. "You can't write drama like this," he said between chuckles. They really thought they owned it. My inbox filled with messages, half from journalists, half from other CEOs offering quiet congratulations, cloaked in politeness. One of them read, "Niece move Carter. That's how you handle blood in business." But not everyone found it entertaining. By 6, Ethan called. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was small, worn. "Emily, please, this has gone too far. Mom's losing it. Reporters are camping outside the house. Can we talk, just me and you?" I deleted the message without replying. Harper came in an hour later with a paper cup of coffee. "You should see this," she said, handing me her phone. It was a live broadcast. The reporters stood outside the Denver property, the same lobby glowing behind her. "Tonight we're learning more about the mysterious CEO who exposed her own family's deceit," she said. "Emily Carter, the woman being called the silent CEO, hasn't spoken publicly, but her actions have already sent ripples through the corporate world." I turned off the sound. The title beneath my photo read, "Justice Served in Silence." Harper set the coffee down. "You could say something you know. I don't need to. People are asking questions. Let them. The truth doesn't need a press release." She studied me for a second. Then she smiled small and tired. "You really don't flinch, do you?" "Only when it matters." Later that night, I drove back to my hotel. Denver at night was beautiful in the way cold things often are. Quiet, precise, almost forgiving. The roads were empty, the snow glowing blue under the streetlights. I parked outside the hotel and sat there for a while, the heater humming softly. The car radio played faintly a local station recapping the story. They called it a lesson in ownership and arrogance. I turned it off before the segment ended. In the room, I poured myself a glass of water and opened my laptop. The legal updates had arrived. The fraud case against my mother's transfer attempt had been filed pending review. Everything was moving as it should. My phone buzzed again. A text from Harper. "They're lawyering up. Linda just hired someone out of LA. Big name. Wants to sue for defamation." I typed back. "Let her try. Truth is a better witness than any lawyer." A few minutes later, I stood by the window looking out over the snow-covered streets. The city lights flickered below, distant and calm. My reflection in the glass looked composed, almost serene. But inside there was a pulse of exhaustion I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't triumph. It was release. The years of pretending, of shrinking myself to make them comfortable, were finally gone. Harper called once more before midnight. She didn't sound worried this time. "The story's stabilizing," she said. "People are already moving on to the next scandal." "Good. You know," she added, "you actually won." I shook my head, even though she couldn't see it. "No, Harper. I just stopped losing." Outside, the snow kept falling slow and steady, blanketing everything in the same quiet that had started it all. I turned off the lights, letting the city fade into a soft amber blur beyond the glass. Tomorrow they would still talk. They always did. But I had nothing left to say. The truth was already louder than any voice I could ever use, and for the first time in a long time, that silence felt like peace. The next morning the snow had thinned, leaving Denver glazed in sunlight that bounced off the glass buildings. I got to the office early. The air smelled faintly of paper and coffee, and for once there was no noise except the soft hum of the heating vents. Harper was already there, her expression careful, a folder tucked under her arm. "They're coming," she said quietly. "Your family." I didn't ask how she knew. News like that carried its own gravity. I poured coffee, set the cup down untouched, and told her to bring them in when they arrived. 15 minutes later, the elevator doors opened. My mother stepped out first, dressed in navy like she was coming to a board meeting, her heels striking sharp against the marble floor. My father followed, silent hands deep in his coat pockets. Ethan trailed behind, eyes fixed somewhere near the floor. The receptionist looked at me for a signal. I nodded. They entered my office as if it were foreign territory. My mother didn't sit. She looked around, taking in the glass walls, the framed press articles, the quiet. Then she turned to me, her voice brittle. "You can't do this to your own family, Emily. It was just a wedding." I stood by the window, the city stretching behind me. "It wasn't just a wedding," I said. "You used my name, my company, my accounts. You forged my signature." She flinched, but didn't back down. "I did it for Ethan. He deserved a proper start. You know how hard it's been for him." I turned to face her fully. "And that makes it right." Her jaw tightened. "I'm your mother." "That's not a defense," I said softly. "It's a description." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the clock ticking somewhere near the bookshelf. Harper stepped forward, then placing a thin stack of papers on the desk. Her tone stayed polite, professional. "We prepared a summary of the findings." My mother's hand trembled slightly as she took the first page. Her eyes skimmed the lines, confusion flickering to anger. "What is this A confirmation?" I said. "You signed this morning." "I didn't sign anything." "You did." "You called it a settlement proposal." "But it was a declaration." acknowledging misuse of company funds and forgery of documentation. Legal has it on file now. Her lips parted, her voice barely more than a whisper. You tricked me. I met her eyes. No, Mom. You assumed everyone still saw you as untouchable. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. Emily, please. Don't make this worse. I looked at him. You're an adult, Ethan. You stood by while she stole from me. You smiled through it. You benefited. That makes you part of it. He looked away. My father's voice broke the silence rougher than I remembered. Maybe it's time we stop pretending this is about a wedding. I almost smiled. Maybe it's time, Dad. My mother shook her head, tears finally rising. I just wanted something beautiful for once, something perfect. You built it on someone else's work, I said. You can't build beauty on theft. She dropped the papers onto the desk. You've always been cold. Even as a child, you never understood love. Maybe, I said quietly. Or maybe I just learned what it looks like when it's conditional. For a while, none of us moved. Outside the window, sunlight hit the buildings across the street, reflecting into the room. The light passed over my mother's face, showing the lines I hadn't noticed before. She stepped closer. Can't you let this go? For the sake of peace, I thought about it. Then I said, peace doesn't come from pretending. It comes from truth. Her voice cracked. I didn't mean to hurt you. You just didn't care if you did. She looked at me, then really looked, and I saw it, the flicker of realization, maybe regret. But it was too late. The paperwork was already filed. The signatures verified the consequences in motion. Harper moved quietly, collecting the loose pages. She glanced at me. Would you like me to escort them out? I shook my head. No. Let them find the door on their own. Ethan stood there looking lost. He finally said, We'll fix it. Somehow. No, I told him. You'll live with it. That's different. He nodded once, unable to meet my eyes. When they left, the door closed gently, like a breath being held. I stayed where I was, facing the window. The city outside shimmered under the sun, the glass of the nearby buildings turning the light back toward me. For the first time, the reflection staring back looked whole. Harper lingered in the doorway. Are you okay? Yes. She studied me, then said quietly, You didn't need to say it that way. I know, but they needed to hear it. The clock ticked again. Somewhere below, the hum of traffic grew louder, a reminder that the world outside hadn't changed even if mine had. Harper placed the signed declaration on my desk. Legal will process it by tomorrow. Once it's finalized, the assets revert fully to your control. Good. She hesitated before leaving. You think she'll forgive you someday? I let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Maybe. But forgiveness isn't the point. When she was gone, I stood alone, sunlight warming the glass. The reflection blurred for a moment, then steadied, and I caught the faintest curve of a smile. It wasn't satisfaction or pride. It was relief. The kind that comes when something poisonous has finally been drained clean. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was earned. And as the city glowed around me, I realized that peace could look exactly like this, bright, quiet, and completely mine. A week later, Denver woke to my name in the headlines again, this time softened by admiration instead of outrage. The morning paper waited on my desk when I arrived, folded neatly beside my coffee. Across the front page, a single line ran in bold print, "The invisible CEO speaks through silence." I sat down, brushing a fingertip over the ink. They always made it sound poetic after the damage was done. Harper appeared in the doorway holding her tablet. The stock valuation's up 12%. Investors are calling this the cleanest corporate recovery in a decade. You just became the face of integrity, she said. I smiled faintly. The irony wasn't lost on me. She sat across from me, crossing one leg over the other. Ethan emailed again. I didn't ask what he said, but she told me anyway. He wants it to stop. Says Mom isn't leaving the house. I looked out the window where sunlight bounced off the glass towers across the street. He's asking the wrong person. Harper tilted her head. You're really not going to answer? There's nothing left to say. The truth already did the talking. She exhaled, then changed the subject. The press conference is in an hour. The board wants a short statement. Keep it short, I said. No apologies, no drama. At the conference, flashes from cameras painted the room in bursts of white light. Journalists lined the back wall, waiting, recording, dissecting every move. I stepped behind the podium, the microphone too close, the air warm from the crowd. Someone called out a question before I even spoke. Ms. Carter, do you have a message for your family? I paused, letting the silence expand until it filled the room. I don't have a message for anyone. I said simply, I don't need to win. I only needed fairness. That was all. No rehearsed speech, no emotion. I walked away from the podium as the reporters shouted follow-ups I didn't answer. The next morning, that single line ran everywhere, quoted, reposted, repeated. People called it dignified. Later that week, Abigail Green stopped by my office, all elegance and purpose. She stood by the window, her reflection sharp in the glass. You know, she said, investors love a redemption story. You just gave them one. I didn't look at her. I didn't need redemption. She smiled faintly. Maybe not. But the market likes women who stand their ground. After she left, the office felt too quiet. Harper came in carrying 2 coffees, setting one in front of me. You know, people keep calling you the invisible CEO. I took the cup, staring into the dark liquid. Maybe because silence makes them nervous. She laughed softly. It also makes them curious. By evening, every major network had aired my interview clip. Commentators debated whether I was brave or ruthless, and social media built its own mythology around me. They called me calculated, cold, brilliant. They were all wrong. It hadn't been calculation. It had been survival. That night, I drove home with the radio off. Streetlights blurred across the windshield as I replayed the day in my head. My mother's face from a week ago still flashed behind my eyes, the tremor in her hands, the crack in her voice. She had finally understood that there was no way back. At a stoplight, my phone buzzed. A news alert. Linda Miller seen leaving home for the first time since scandal. The accompanying photo showed her getting into a car, head lowered, her once perfect posture slumped. For a moment, something twisted inside me. Regret, maybe pity. But it passed. I reminded myself of every dinner table where silence had been my punishment, every time she called my work luck instead of labor. By the time I reached my building, the air felt lighter. Upstairs, I opened the curtains wide. The city stretched out beneath me, full of its own rhythm, taxis, crawling people, moving lights, winking in windows. Harper texted around 9. Your quote's trending. I only needed fairness. I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair. Outside, my reflection floated in the glass, steady and quiet. Some victories don't come with applause. They come with stillness, with the knowledge that you didn't bend, didn't scream, didn't break. Somewhere out there, my family was learning that silence has a price. Mine had just been paid in full. When I left the office the next day, snow began again, fine and glittering under the streetlights. Reporters were still camped across the street, but none of them called out to me. They only lifted their cameras, hoping for another line to print. I didn't give them one. I just kept walking, coat pulled tight against the wind. Behind me, the glass doors of the building reflected the city's light, my outline in it small but clear. The air smelled of cold metal and snow. There were no cheers, no cameras flashing in my face, just the quiet satisfaction of having my name mean something again. For the first time standing there in the freezing air, I realized this was what real victory felt like. Not noise, not revenge, just the calm certainty that the truth had finally learned how to speak on its own. A year later, spring had returned to Colorado, but the mountains still carried streaks of white at their peaks, glowing against the morning sun. I stood outside a glass building that shimmered like it was made of light itself. The sign above the doors read, Aurora Hall. The letters gleamed simple and strong, and for the first time in years, my name wasn't the one in front. That felt right. Inside, people filled the lobby, voices low and warm. They came from everywhere. Women with notebooks, laptops, tired eyes, determined smiles. Some were young and hopeful, some older and starting over. Harper moved through the crowd, introducing me to donors, mentors, and the volunteers who had helped build it. She looked radiant in the pale sunlight, her expression half pride, half disbelief. "Can you believe it's been a year?" she said softly, as we stepped into the main hall. "I can," I said. "Every day of it." The space was filled with light from the glass roof. Rows of chairs lined the stage, the smell of fresh coffee and flowers mixing with the crisp air. The guests took their seats, murmuring until the microphone caught a quiet crackle. Harper walked up first, greeting everyone with the ease of someone who had waited for this moment. She told the story of Aurora Hall, how it began as an idea during a season of endings, how it was built for women who had been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. Then she turned toward me and smiled, and now she said, "Let me introduce someone who turned silence into a legacy. Emily Carter." Applause rose like a wave, soft but full. I stepped forward, the lights gentle against my face. For a second I hesitated. The podium felt smaller than the ones I'd stood behind before, but the weight of this one meant more. I took a breath, hearing my voice echo through the hall. "Aurora isn't about second chances," I said. "It's about places that should have existed all along, for anyone who was ever told they weren't enough, or that they didn't belong. Here no one has to ask for permission to start again." I paused, watching faces in the crowd. Some nodded, others wiped their eyes. "This place exists because silence shouldn't be punishment," I continued. "It should be choice. It should be power." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the room. When it quieted, Harper joined me on stage. The sunlight poured through the glass ceiling, painting the floor gold. She leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you feel now?" "Peaceful," I said. She smiled. "You did it, Emily." "No," I said. "We did it." After the ceremony, guests drifted toward the reception area, talking in small groups. Reporters hovered near the back, but didn't push for statements. They had learned by now that I preferred few words. The work spoke louder. Outside, the snow from the previous week had melted, leaving the mountains reflected in small pools of water on the stone walkway. I stepped out to the balcony overlooking the valley. The wind was cool and clean. Below, the sign glowed softly, "Aurora Hall, home for all voices." Harper came to stand beside me, her hands tucked in her coat pockets. "Remember the day you canceled that wedding?" she said, half laughing. "Hard to forget," I said. "You think this place came from that?" "Maybe," I said. "Some endings are just disguised beginnings." We stood there for a while, watching the light shift over the peaks. People moved inside behind the glass, laughter rising now and then. I could still hear the faint hum of cameras, the chatter of new plans being made. The world went on quieter, maybe kinder. I thought of my mother then. The last I'd heard, she'd sold the house and moved somewhere near the coast. There was no apology, no letter, just distance. And that was enough. Forgiveness. I'd learned didn't always need to travel both ways. Harper turned toward the hall. "You coming back inside?" "In a minute." She nodded, leaving me alone on the balcony. I rested my hands on the railing, the cold metal grounding me. The mountains stretched out forever, sharp and blue against the horizon. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who sat at dinner tables pretending not to hear the things said about her, who worked harder just to be seen. That girl was gone, but the lesson she learned had built this place brick by brick. Behind me, the glass doors reflected the building's name again. Aurora. It meant dawn, the first light after the dark. For a long moment, I just stood there, letting the wind brush against my face. Then I whispered to no one in particular. "They shut me out of one celebration, so I built a world where no one gets shut out again." The sky turned gold, then deepened into rose as the sun lowered behind the peaks. The snow caught the last light and shimmered like tiny mirrors. In the stillness, I realized this was what freedom truly was. Not escaping the past, but standing in it and choosing what comes next. If you've ever been told you don't belong, remember this. Sometimes the door that closes in front of you isn't rejection, it's direction. It's the beginning of something you were meant to build yourself. I turned back toward the hall as the lights inside glowed brighter against the dusk. Voices echoed softly through the glass, mingling with the wind. And somewhere between the sound of laughter and the fading sun, I knew the story wasn't ending here. It was only just beginning.